In the mother's mind, there was the same anxiety, and in her it was mingled with another further fear, lest Janet, in her present excited state of mind, should take some premature step in relation to her husband, which might lead back to all the former troubles. The hint she had thrown out in the morning of her wish to return to him, after a time, showed a new eagerness for difficult duties that only made the long-saddened, sober mother tremble. But as evening approached, Janet's morning heroism all forsook her imagination, influenced by physical depression, as well as by mental habits, was haunted by the vision of her husband's return home, and she began to shudder with the yesterday's dread. She heard him calling her. She saw him going to her mother's to look for her. She felt sure he would find her out and burst in upon her. "Pray, pray, don't leave me, don't go to church," she said to Mrs. Pettifer. "You and mother both stay with me till Mr. Tryon comes." At 20 minutes past 6, the church bells were ringing for the evening service, and soon the congregation was streaming along Orchard Street in the mellow sunset. The street opened toward the west. The red half-sunken sun shed a solemn splendor on the everyday houses, and crimsoned the windows of Dempster's projecting upper story. Suddenly a loud murmur arose, and spread along the stream of churchgoers, and one group after another paused, and looked backward at the far end of the street. Men, accompanied by a miscellaneous group of onlookers, were slowly carrying something. A body stretched on a door. Slowly they passed along the middle of the street, lined all the way with awestruck faces, till they turned aside, and paused in the red sunlight before Dempster's door. It was Dempster's body. No one knew whether he was alive or dead. Chapter 22. It was probably a hard saying to the Pharisees that there is more joy in heaven over one sinner that repenteth than over 99 just persons that need no repentance, and certain ingenious philosophers of our own day must surely take offense at a joy so entirely out of correspondence with arithmetical proportion. But a heart that has been taught by its own sore struggles to bleed for the woes of another, that has learned pity through suffering, is likely to find very imperfect satisfaction in the balance of happiness, doctrine of compensations, and other short and easy methods of obtaining thorough complacency in the presence of pain. And, for such a heart, that saying will not be altogether dark. The emotions, I have observed, are but slightly influenced by arithmetical considerations. The mother, when her sweet lisping little ones have all been taken from her one after another, and she is hanging over her last dead babe, finds small consolation in the fact that the tiny dimpled corpse is but one of a necessary average, and that 1,000 other babes brought into the world at the same time are doing well, and are likely to live. And if you stood beside that mother, if you knew her pang and shared it is probable you would be equally unable to see a ground of complacency in statistics. Doubtless a complacency resting on that basis is highly rational, but emotion, I fear, is obstinately irrational. It insists on caring for individuals. It absolutely refuses to adopt the quantitative view of human anguish, and to admit that 13 happy lives are a set-off against 12 miserable lives, which leaves a clear balance on the side of satisfaction. This is the inherent imbecility of feeling, and one must be a great philosopher to have got quite clear of all that, and to have emerged into the serene air of pure intellect, in which it is evident that individuals really exist for no other purpose than that abstractions may be drawn from them, abstractions that may rise from heaps of ruined lives, like the sweet savor of a sacrifice, in the nostrils of philosophers and of a philosophically deity. And so it comes to pass that for the man who knows sympathy, because he has known sorrow, that old saying about the joy of angels over the repentant sinner outweighing their joy over the 99, just has a meaning which does not jar with the language of his own heart. It only tells him that for angels too, there is a transcendent value in human pain, which refuses to be settled by equations, that the eyes of angels too are turned away from the serene happiness of the righteous, to bend with yearning pity on the poor erring soul, wandering in the desert where no water is, that for angels too, the misery of one casts so tremendous a shadow as to eclipse the bliss of 99. Mr. Tryon had gone through the initiation of suffering. It is no wonder, then, that Janet's restoration was the work that lay nearest his heart, and that, weary as he was in body, when he entered the vestry, after the evening service, he was impatient to fulfill the promise of seeing her. His experience enabled him to divine what was the fact that the hopefulness of the morning would be followed by a return of depression and discouragement, and his sense of the inward and outward difficulties in the way of her restoration was so keen that he could only find relief from the foreboding it excited by lifting up his heart in prayer There are unseen elements, which often frustrate our wisest calculations, which raise up the sufferer from the edge of the grave, contradicting the prophecies of the clear-sighted physician, and fulfilling the blind, clinging hopes of affection. Such unseen elements Mr. Tryon called the divine will, and filled up the margin of ignorance, which surrounds all our knowledge, with the feelings of trust and resignation. Perhaps the profoundest philosophy could hardly fill it up better. His mind was occupied in this way, as he was absently taking off his gown, when Mr. Landor startled him by entering the vestry, and asking abruptly, "Have you heard the news about Dempster?" "No," said Mr. Tryon anxiously. "What is it?" "He has been thrown out of his gig in the bridgeway, and he was taken up for dead. They were carrying him home as we were coming to church, and I stayed behind to see what I could do. I went in to speak to Mrs. Dempster, and prepare her a little, but she was not at home. Dempster is not dead, however. He was stunned with the fall. Pilgrim came in a few minutes, and he says the right leg is broken in 2 places. It's likely to be a terrible case with his state of body. It seems he was more drunk than usual. And they say he came along the bridgeway flogging his horse like a madman, till at last it gave a sudden wheel, and he was pitched out." The servants said they didn't know where Mrs. Dempster was. She had been away from home since yesterday morning, but Mrs. Rayner knew. "I know where she is," said Mr. Tryon, "but I think it will be better for her not to be told of this just yet." Ah, that was what Pilgrim said, and so I didn't go round to Mrs. Rayner's. He said it would be all the better if Mrs. Dempster could be kept out of the house for the present. "Do you know if anything new has happened between Dempster and his wife lately? I was surprised to hear of her being at Paddiford Church this morning." "Yes, something has happened, but I believe she is anxious that the particulars of his behavior towards her should not be known. She is at Mrs. Pettifer's. There is no reason for concealing that, since what has happened to her husband, and yesterday, when she was in very deep trouble, she sent for me. I was very thankful she did so. I believe a great change of feeling has begun in her, but she is at present in that excitable state of mind, has been shaken by so many painful emotions during the last 2 days, that I think it would be better for this evening at least to guard her from a new shock if possible. But I am going now to call upon her, and I shall see how she is." "Mr. Tryon," said Mr. Jerome, who had entered during the dialogue, and had been standing by listening with a distressed face, "I shall take it as a favor if y'all let me know if either there's anything I can do for Mrs. Dempster. Dear, what a world this is. I think I see 15 year ago as happy a young couple as Ivor was. And now what it's all come to. I was in a hurry like to punish Dempster for persecutin', but there was a stronger hand at work, nor mine." "Yes, Mr. Jerome, but don't let us rejoice in punishment, even when the hand of God alone inflicts it. The best of us are but poor wretches just saved from shipwreck. Can we feel anything but awe and pity when we see a fellow passenger swallowed by the waves?" Right, Mr. Tryon, I am over hot and hasty, that I am, but I beg on you to tell Mrs. Dempster, I mean, in course when you've an opportunity, title her. She's a friend at the White House, as she may send for any hour o' the day." "Yes, I shall have an opportunity, I dare say, and I will remember your wish. I think," continued Mr. Tryon, turning to Mr. Landor, "I had better see Mr. Pilgrim on my way, and learn what is exactly the state of things by this time. What do you think?" "By all means, if Mrs. Dempster is to know, there's no one can break the news to her so well as you. I'll walk with you to Dempster's door. I dare say. Pilgrim, is there still come? Mr. Jerome, you've got to go our way too to fetch your horse." Mr. Pilgrim was in the passage giving some directions to his assistant, when to his surprise, he saw Mr. Tryon enter. They shook hands, for Mr. Pilgrim, never having joined the party of the anti-Tryonites, had no ground for resisting the growing conviction that the evangelical curate was really a good fellow, though he was a fool for not taking better care of himself. "Why, I didn't expect to see you in your old enemy's quarters," he said to Mr. Tryon. "However, it will be a good while before poor Dempster shows any fight again." "I came on Mrs. Dempster's account," said Mr. Tryon. "She is staying at Mrs. Pettifer's. She has had a great shock from some severe domestic trouble lately, and I think it will be wiser to defer telling her of this dreadful event for a short time." "Why, what has been up, said Mr. Pilgrim, whose curiosity was at once awakened. "She used to be no friend of yours. Has there been some split between them? It's a new thing for her to turn round on him." "Oh, merely an exaggeration of scenes that must often have happened before, but the question now is whether you think there is any immediate danger of her husband's death, for in that case, I think from what I have observed of her feelings, she would be pained afterwards to have been kept in ignorance. Well, there's no telling in these cases, you know I don't apprehend speedy death, and it is not absolutely impossible that we may bring him round again. At present he's in a state of apoplectic stupor. But if that subsides, delirium is almost sure to supervene, and we shall have some painful scenes. It's one of those complicated cases in which the delirium is likely to be of the worst kind, meningitis, and delirium tremens togtherand. We may have a good deal of trouble with him. If Mrs. Dempster were told, I should say, it would be desirable to persuade her to remain out of the house at present. She could do no good, you know. I've got nurses. Thank you, said Mr. Tryon. That is what I wanted to know. Goodbye. When Mrs. Pettifer opened the door for Mr. Tryon, he told her in a few words what had happened, and begged her to take an opportunity of letting Mrs. Rayner know that they might if possible concur in preventing a premature or sudden disclosure of the event to Janet. Poor thing, said Mrs. Pettifer, she's not fit to hear any bad news. She's very low this evening, worn out with feeling, and she's not had anything to keep her up, as she's been used to. She seems frightened at the thought of being tempted to take it. Thank God for it, that fear is her greatest security. When Mr. Tryon entered the parlor, this time Janet was again awaiting him eagerly, and her pale sad face was lighted up with a smile as she rose to meet him. But the next moment, she said with a look of anxiety, how very ill and tired you look. You have been working so hard all day. And yet you are come to talk to me. Oh, you are wearing yourself out. I must go and ask Mrs. Pettifer to come and make you have some supper. But this is my mother. You have not seen her before, I think. While Mr. Tryon was speaking to Mrs. Rayner, Janet hurried out, and he, seeing that this good-natured thoughtfulness on his behalf would help to counteract her depression, was not inclined to oppose her wish, but accepted the supper. Mrs. Pettifer offered him, quietly talking the while about a clothing club he was going to establish in Paddiford, and the want of provident habits among the poor. Presently, however, Mrs. Rayner said she must go home for an hour to see how her little maiden was going on, and Mrs. Pettifer left the room with her, to take the opportunity of telling her what had happened to Dempster. When Janet was left alone with Mr. Tryon, she said, I feel so uncertain what to do about my husband. I am so weak. Me feelings change so from hour to hour. This morning, when I felt so hopeful and happy, I thought I should like to go back to him and try to make up for what has been wrong in me. I thought now God would help me, and I should have you to teach and advise me, and I could bear the troubles that would come. But since then, all this afternoon and evening, I have had the same feelings. I used to have the same dread of his anger and cruelty, and it seems to me as if I should never be able to bear it without falling into the same sins, and doing just what I did before. Yet, if it were settled that I should live apart from him, I know it would always be a load on my mind that I had shut myself out from going back to him. It seems a dreadful thing in life, when anyone has been so near to one as a husband for 15 years, to part and be nothing to each other any more. Surely, that is a very strong tie, and I feel as if my duty can never lie quite away from it. It is very difficult to know what to do. What ought I to do? I think it will be well not to take any decisive step, yet wait until your mind is calmer. You might remain with your mother for a little while. I think you have no real ground for fearing any annoyance from your husband at present. He has put himself too much in the wrong. He will very likely leave you unmolested for some time. Dismiss this difficult question from your mind just now, if you can. Every new day may bring you new grounds for decision, and what is most needful for your health of mind is repose from that haunting anxiety about the future which has been preying on you. Cast yourself on God, and trust that He will direct you. He will make your duty clear to you if you wait submissively on Him. Yes, I will wait a little as you tell me. I will go to my mother's tomorrow and pray to be guided rightly. You will pray for me too. Chapter 23. The next morning Janet was so much calmer, and at breakfast spoke so decidedly of going to her mother's, that Mrs. Pettifer and Mrs. Rayner agreed it would be wise to let her know by degrees what had befallen her husband, since as soon as she went out there would be danger of her meeting someone who would betray the fact. But Mrs. Rayner thought it would be well first to call at Dempster's and ascertain how he was. So she said to Janet, my dear, go home first and see to things, and get your room ready. You needn't come, yet you know I shall be back again in an hour or so, and we can go together. Oh no, said Mrs. Pettifer, stay with me till evening. I shall be lost without you. You needn't go till quite evening. Janet had dipped into the life of Henry Martyn, which Mrs. Pettifer had from the Paddiford Lending Library, and her interest was so arrested by that pathetic missionary story that she readily acquiesced in both propositions, and Mrs. Rayner set out. She had been gone more than an hour, and it was nearly 12 o'clock when Janet put down her book, and after sitting meditatively for some minutes with her eyes unconsciously fixed on the opposite wall, she rose, went to her bedroom, and hastily putting on her bonnet and shawl came down to Mrs. Pettifer, who was busy in the kitchen. "Mrs. Pettifer," she said, "tell mother, when she comes back I am gone to see what has become of those poor lackins in Butcher's Lane. I know they're a half-starving and I've neglected them so lately. And then I think I'll go on to Mrs. Crewe. I want to see the dear little woman, and tell her myself about my going to hear Mr. Tryon. She won't feel it half so much if I tell her myself." "Won't you wait till your mother comes or put it off till tomorrow?" said Mrs. Pettifer, alarmed. "You'll hardly be back in time for dinner if you get talking to Mrs. Crewe. And you'll have to pass by your husband's, you know, and yesterday you were so afraid of seeing him. Oh, Robert will be shut up at the office now. If he's not gone out of the town, I must go. I feel I must be doing something for someone, not be a mere useless log any longer. I've been reading about that wonderful Henry Martin. He's just like Mr. Tryon, wearing himself out for other people. And I sit thinking of nothing but myself. I must go. Goodbye, I shall be back soon." She ran off before Mrs. Pettifer could utter another word of dissuasion, leaving the good woman in considerable anxiety, lest this new impulse of Janet's should frustrate all precautions to save her from a sudden shock. Janet, having paid her visit in Butcher Lane, turned again into Orchard Street on her way to Mrs. Crewe's, and was thinking rather sadly that her mother's economical housekeeping would leave no abundant surplus to be sent to the hungry lackins, when she saw Mr. Pilgrim in advance of her on the other side of the street. He was walking at a rapid pace, and when he reached Dempster's door he turned and entered without knocking. Janet was startled. Mr. Pilgrim would never enter in that way, unless there were someone very ill in the house. It was her husband, she felt certain of it. At once something had happened to him. Without a moment's pause, she ran across the street, opened the door, and entered. There was no one in the passage. The dining room was wide open. No one was there. Mr. Pilgrim then was already upstairs. She rushed up at once to Dempster's room, her own room. The door was open, and she paused in pale horror at the sight before her, which seemed to stand out only with the more appalling distinctness because the noonday light was darkened to twilight in the chamber. Two strong nurses were using their utmost force to hold Dempster in bed, while the medical assistant was applying a sponge to his head, and Mr. Pilgrim was busy adjusting some apparatus. In the background, Dempster's face was purple and swollen, his eyes dilated and fixed with a look of dire terror on something he seemed to see approaching him from the iron closet. He trembled violently and struggled as if to jump out of bed. Let me go," he said, in a loud hoarse whisper. "She's coming, she's cold, she's dead, she'll strangle me with her black hair." Ah, he shrieked aloud, "Her hair is all serpents, they're a black serpents, they hiss. They hiss. Let me go, she wants to drag me with her cold arms, her arms are serpents. They are great white serpents, they'll twine round me. She wants to drag me into the cold water, her bosom is cold, it is black, it is all serpents." "No, Robert," Janet cried in tones of yearning pity, rushing to the side of the bed and stretching out her arms towards him. "No, here is Janet, she is not dead, she forgives you." Dempster's maddened senses seemed to receive some new impression from her appearance. The terror gave way to rage. "Ha, you sneaking hypocrite," he burst out in a grating voice. "You threaten me, you mean to have your revenge on me, do you? Do your worst. I've got the law on my side. I know the law. I'll hunt you down like a hare. Prove it, prove that I was tampered with, prove that I took the money, prove it." "You can prove nothing, you damned somsinging maggots. I'll make a fire under you and smoke off the whole pack of you. I'll sweep you up, I'll grind you to powder, small powder." Here his voice dropped to a low tone of shuddering disgust. "Powder on the bedclothes, running about black lice. They are coming in swarms, Janet, come and take them away. Curse you, why don't you come, Janet?" Poor Janet was kneeling by the bed with her face buried in her hands. She almost wished her worst moment back again. Rather than this, it seemed as if her husband was already imprisoned in misery, and she could not reach him, his ear deaf forever to the sounds of love and forgiveness. His sins had made a hard crust round his soul. Her pitying voice could not pierce it. "Not there isn't she," he went on in a defiant tone. "Why do you ask me where she is? I'll have every drop of yellow blood out of your veins. If you come questioning me, your blood is yellow in your purse, running out of your purse. What you're changing it into toads, are you? They're crawling, they're flying about my head. The toads are flying about. Ostler, ostler, bring out my gig, bring it out, you lazy beast. Ha, y'all follow me, will you? Y'all fly about my head. You've got fiery tongues. Ostler curse you, why don't you come Janet, come and take the toads away Janet. This last time, he uttered her name with such a shriek of terror that Janet involuntarily started up from her knees, and stood as if petrified by the horrible vibration. Dempster stared wildly in silence for some moments. Then he spoke again in a hoarse whisper. Dead is she dead, she did it, then she buried herself in the iron chest. She left her clothes out, though she isn't dead. Why do you pretend she's dead? She's coming out of the iron closet. There are the black serpents, stop her. Let me go, stop her. She wants to drag me away into the cold black water, her bosom is black. It is all serpents, they are getting longer, the great white serpents are getting longer. Here Mr. Pilgrim came forward with the apparatus to bind him, but Dempster's struggles became more and more violent. Ostler, Ostler. He shouted, bring out the gig, give me the whip end. Bursting loose from the strong hands that held him, he began to flog the bedclothes furiously with his right arm. Get along, you lame brutesques, that's it, there you go, they think they've outwitted me, do they, the sneaking idiots, I'll be up with them by and by. I'll make them say the Lord's Prayer backwards, I'll pepper them, so that the devil shall eat them raw. SCSCSCWE, shall see Hall be the winner, yet get along, you damned limping beast, I'll lay your back open. He raised himself with a stronger effort than ever to flog the bedclothes, and fell back in convulsions. Janet gave a scream and sank on her knees again. She thought he was dead. As soon as Mr. Pilgrim was able to give her a moment's attention, he came to her, and taking her by the arm, attempted to draw her gently out of the room. Now, my dear Mrs. Dempster, let me persuade you not to remain in the room at present. We shall soon relieve these symptoms. I hope it is nothing but the delirium that ordinarily attends such cases. Oh, what is the matter? What brought it on? He fell out of the gig, the right leg is broken, it is a terrible accident, and I don't disguise that there is considerable danger attending it owing to the state of the brain. But Mr. Dempster has a strong constitution, you know, in a few days, these symptoms may be allayed. And he may do well. Let me beg of you to keep out of the room at present, you can do no good, until Mr. Dempster is better and able to know you, but you ought not to be alone. Let me advise you to have Mrs. Rayner with you. Yes, I will send for mother, but you must not object to my being in the room. I shall be very quiet now, only just at first the shock was so great I knew nothing about it. I can help the nurses a great deal, I can put the cold things to his head, he may be sensible for a moment, and know me, pray do not say any more against it, my heart is set on being with him. Mr. Pilgrim gave way, and Janet, having sent for her mother, and put off her bonnet and shawl, returned to take her place by the side of her husband's bed. Chapter 24. Day after day, with only short intervals of rest, Janet kept her place in that sad chamber. No wonder the sick room and the lazaretto have so often been a refuge from the tossings of intellectual doubt, a place of repose for the worn and wounded spirit. Here is a duty about which all creeds and all philosophies are at one. Here at least the conscience will not be dogged by doubt. The benign impulse will not be checked by adverse theory. Here you may begin to act without settling one preliminary question, to moisten the sufferer's parched lips through the long night watches, to bear up the drooping head, to lift the helpless limbs, to divine the want that can find no utterance beyond the feeble motion of the hand, or beseeching glance of the eyes, are offices that demand no self-questionings, no casuistry, no assent to propositions, no weighing of consequences within the four walls, where the stir and glare of the world are shut out, and every voice is subdued, where a human being lies prostrate, thrown on the tender mercies of his fellow. The moral relation of man to man is reduced to its utmost clearness and simplicity. Bigotry cannot confuse it, theory cannot pervert it, passion awed into quiescence can neither pollute nor perturb it. As we bend over the sickbed, all the forces of our nature rush towards the channels of pity, of patience, and of love, and sweep down the miserable choking drift of our quarrels, our debates, our wood wisdom, and our clamorous selfish desires. This blessing of serene freedom from the importunities of opinion lies in all simple direct acts of mercy, and is one source of that sweet calm which is often felt by the watcher in the sick room, even when the duties there are of a hard and terrible kind. Something of that benign result was felt by Janet during her attendance in her husband's chamber, when the first heart-piercing hours were over, when her horror at his delirium was no longer fresh. She began to be conscious of her relief from the burden of decision as to her future course. The question that agitated her about returning to her husband had been solved in a moment, and this illness after all might be the herald of another blessing, just as that dreadful midnight, when she stood an outcast in cold and darkness, had been followed by the dawn of a new hope. Robert would get better. This illness might alter him. He would be a long time feeble, needing help walking with a crutch perhaps. She would wait on him with such tenderness, such all-forgiving love, that the old harshness and cruelty must melt away. Forever under the heart sunshine she would pour around him. Her bosom heaved at the thought, and delicious tears fell. Janet's was a nature in which hatred and revenge could find no place. The long bitter years drew half their bitterness from her ever-living remembrance of the 2 short years of love that went before, and the thought that her husband would ever put her hand to his lips again, and recall the days when they sat on the grass together, and he laid scarlet poppies on her black hair, and called her his gypsy queen, seemed to send a tide of loving oblivion over all the harsh and stony space they had traversed. Since the divine love that had already shone upon her would be with her, she would lift up her soul continually for help. Mr. Tryon, she knew, would pray for her. If she felt herself failing, she would confess it to him at once. If her feet began to slip, there was that stay for her to cling to. Oh, she could never be drawn back into that cold, damp vault of sin and despair again. She had felt the morning sun, she had tasted the sweet, pure air of trust and penitence and submission. These were the thoughts passing through Janet's mind as she hovered about her husband's bed, and these were the hopes she poured out to Mr. Tryon when he called to see her. It was so evident that they were strengthening her in her new struggle. They shed such a glow of calm enthusiasm over her face as she spoke of them that Mr. Tryon could not bear to throw on them the chill of premonitory doubts, though a previous conversation he had with Mr. Pilgrim had convinced him that there was not the faintest probability of Dempster's recovery. Poor Janet did not know the significance of the changing symptoms, and when after the lapse of a week, the delirium began to lose some of its violence, and to be interrupted by longer and longer intervals of stupor, she tried to think that these might be steps on the way to recovery, and she shrank from questioning Mr. Pilgrim lest he should confirm the fears that began to get predominance in her mind. But before many days were past, he thought it right not to allow her to blind herself any longer. One day, it was just about noon, when bad news always seems most sickening, led her from her husband's chamber into the opposite drawing-room, where Mrs. Rayner was sitting, and said to her in that low tone of sympathetic feeling, which sometimes gave a sudden air of gentleness to this rough man, "My dear Mrs. Dempster, it is right in these cases, you know, to be prepared for the worst. I think I shall be saving you pain by preventing you from entertaining any false hopes, and Mr. Dempster's state is now such that I fear we must consider recovery impossible. The affection of the brain might not have been hopeless, but you see there is a terrible complication, and I am grieved to say the broken limb is mortifying." Janet listened with a sinking heart. That future of love and forgiveness would never come then. He was going out of her sight forever, where her pity could never reach him. She turned cold and trembled. "But do you think he will die?" she said, "without ever coming to himself, without ever knowing me?" One cannot say that with certainty. It is not impossible that the cerebral oppression may subside, and that he may become conscious. If there is anything you would wish to be said or done in that case, it would be well to be prepared. I should think," Mr. Pilgrim continued, turning to Mrs. Rayner, "Mr. Dempster's affairs are likely to be in order. His will is—" "Oh, I wouldn't have him troubled about those things," interrupted Janet. "He has no relations, but quite distant ones. No one but me. I wouldn't take up the time with that. I only want to—" She was unable to finish. She felt her sobs rising, and left the room. "O God," she said inwardly, "is not thy love greater than mine? Have mercy on him, have mercy on him." This happened on Wednesday, 10 days after the fatal accident. By the following Sunday, Dempster was in a state of rapidly increasing prostration, and when Mr. Pilgrim, who in turn with his assistant had slept in the house from the beginning, came in about 10:30, as usual, he scarcely believed that the feebly struggling life would last out till morning. For the last few days he had been administering stimulants to relieve the exhaustion which had succeeded the alternations of delirium and stupor. This slight office was all that now remained to be done for the patient. So, at 11 o'clock, Mr. Pilgrim went to bed, having given directions to the nurse, and desired her to call him if any change took place, or if Mrs. Dempster desired his presence. Janet could not be persuaded to leave the room. She was yearning and watching for a moment in which her husband's eyes would rest consciously upon her, and he would know that she had forgiven him. How changed he was since that terrible Monday. Nearly a fortnight ago he lay motionless, but for the irregular breathing that stirred his broad chest and thick muscular neck. His features were no longer purple and swollen, they were pale, sunken, and haggard a cold perspiration stood in beads on the protuberant forehead, and on the wasted hands stretched motionless on the bedclothes. It was better to see the hands so than convulsively picking the air as they had been a week ago. Janet sat on the edge of the bed, through the long hours of candlelight watching the unconscious half-closed eyes, wiping the perspiration from the brow and cheeks, and keeping her left hand on the cold unanswering right hand that lay beside her on the bedclothes. She was almost as pale as her dying husband, and there were dark lines under her eyes, for this was the third night since she had taken off her clothes, but the eager straining gaze of her dark eyes, and the acute sensibility that lay in every line about her mouth, made a strange contrast with the blank unconsciousness and emaciated animalism of the face she was watching. There was profound stillness in the house. She heard no sound but her husband's breathing, and the ticking of the watch on the mantelpiece. The candle, placed high up, shed a soft light down on the one object she cared to see. There was a smell of brandy in the room. It was given to her husband from time to time, but this smell, which at first had produced in her a faint shuddering sensation, was now becoming indifferent to her. She did not even perceive it. She was too unconscious of herself to feel either temptations or accusations. She only felt that the husband of her youth was dying far, far out of her reach, as if she were standing helpless on the shore, while he was sinking in the black storm waves. She only yearned for one moment, in which she might satisfy the deep forgiving pity of her soul, by one look of love, one word of tenderness. Her sensations and thoughts were so persistent that she could not measure the hours, and it was a surprise to her when the nurse put out the candle, and let in the faint morning light. Mrs. Rayner, anxious about Janet, was already up and now brought in some fresh coffee for her, and Mr. Pilgrim, having awaked, had hurried on his clothes, and was coming in to see how Dempster was. This change from candlelight to morning, this recommencement of the same round of things that had happened yesterday, was a discouragement rather than a relief to Janet. She was more conscious of her chill weariness. The new light thrown on her husband's face seemed to reveal the still work that death had been doing through the night. She felt her last lingering hope that he would ever know her again, forsake her. But now Mr. Pilgrim, having felt the pulse, was putting some brandy in a teaspoon between Dempster's lips. The brandy went down, and his breathing became freer. Janet noticed the change, and her heart beat faster as she leaned forward to watch him. Suddenly, a slight movement, like the passing away of a shadow, was visible in his face, and he opened his eyes full on Janet. It was almost like meeting him again on the resurrection morning, after the night of the grave. "Robert, do you know me?" He kept his eyes fixed on her, and there was a faintly perceptible motion of the lips, as if he wanted to speak. But the moment of speech was forever gone. The moment for asking pardon of her, if he wanted to ask it, could he read the full forgiveness that was written in her eyes? She never knew, for as she was bending to kiss him, the thick veil of death fell between them, and her lips touched a corpse. Chapter 25. The faces looked very hard and unmoved that surrounded Dempster's grave, while old Mr. Crewe read the burial service in his low, broken voice. The pallbearers were such men as Mr. Pittman, Mr. Loam, and Mr. Budman, whom Dempster had called his friends while he was in life, and worldly faces never look so worldly as at a funeral. They have the same effect of grating incongruity as the sound of a coarse voice breaking the solemn silence of night. The one face that had sorrow in it was covered by a thick crape veil, and the sorrow was suppressed and silent. No one knew how deep it was, for the thought in most of her neighbors' minds was that Mrs. Dempster could hardly have had better fortune than to lose a bad husband who had left her the compensation of a good income. They found it difficult to conceive that her husband's death could be felt by her otherwise than as a deliverance. The person who was most thoroughly convinced that Janet's grief was deep and real was Mr. Pilgrim, who in general was not at all weakly given to a belief in disinterested feeling. "That woman has a tender heart," he was frequently heard to observe in his morning rounds about this time. "I used to think there was a great deal of palaver in her, but you may depend upon it, there's no pretense about her. If he'd been the kindest husband in the world, she couldn't have felt more. There's a great deal of good in Mrs. Dempster, a great deal of good." "I always said so," was Mrs. Loam's reply when he made the observation to her. "She was always so very full of pretty attentions to me when I was Roman 99. But they tell me now she's turned Trionite. If that's it, we shan't agree again. It's very inconsistent in her, I think, turning round in that way, after being the foremost to laugh at the Trionite cant. And especially in a woman of her habits, she should cure herself of them before she pretends to be over-religious." "Well, I think she means to cure herself, do you know," said Mr. Pilgrim, whose goodwill towards Janet was just now quite above that temperate point at which he could indulge his feminine patience with a little judicious detraction. I feel sure she has not taken any stimulants all through her husband's illness, and she has been constantly in the way of them. I can see she sometimes suffers a good deal of depression for want of themet. Shows all the more resolution in her, those cures are rare. But I've known them happen sometimes with people of strong will. Mrs. Loam took an opportunity of retailing Mr. Pilgrim's conversation to Mrs. Phipps, who as a victim of Pratt and plethora, could rarely enjoy that pleasure at first hand. Mrs. Phipps was a woman of decided opinions, though of wheezy utterance. For my part, she remarked, I'm glad to hear there's any likelihood of improvement in Mrs. Dempster. But I think the way things have turned out seems to show that she was more to blame than people thought she was, else why should she feel so much about her husband? And Dempster, I understand, has left his wife pretty nearly all his property to do as she likes with that isn't behaving like such a very bad husband. I don't believe Mrs. Dempster can have had so much provocation as they pretended. I've known husbands who've laid plans for tormenting their wives when they're underground teeing up their money and hindering them from marrying again. Not that I should ever wish to marry again. I think one husband in one's life is enough in all conscience. Her. She threw a fierce glance at the amiable Mr. Phipps, who was innocently delighting himself with the feisty in the Rotherby Guardian, and thinking the editor must be a droll fellow, but it's aggravating to be tied up in that way. Why, they say Mrs. Dempster will have as good as 600 a year, at least a fine thing for her. That was a poor girl, without a farthing to her fortune. It's well, if she doesn't make ducks and drakes of it somehow. Mrs. Phipps's view of Janet, however, was far from being the prevalent one in Milby. Even neighbors, who had no strong personal interest in her, could hardly see the noble-looking woman in her widow's dress with a sad, sweet gravity in her face, and not be touched with fresh admiration for her, and not feel, at least vaguely, that she had entered on a new life in which it was a sort of desecration to allude to the painful past, and the old friends, who had a real regard for her, but whose cordiality had been repelled, or chilled of late years, now came round her with hearty demonstrations of affection. Mr. Jerome felt that his happiness had a substantial addition. Now he could once more call on that nice little woman Mrs. Dempster, and think of her with rejoicing instead of sorrow. The Pratts lost no time in returning to the footing of old established friendship with Janet, and her mother and Miss Pratt felt it incumbent on her on all suitable occasions to deliver a very emphatic approval of the remarkable strength of mind she understood Mrs. Dempster to be exhibiting. The Miss Linnets were eager to meet Mr. Tryon's wishes by greeting Janet as one who was likely to be a sister in religious feeling and good works. And Mrs. Linnet was so agreeably surprised by the fact that Dempster had left his wife the money in that handsome way to do what she liked with it, that she even included Dempster himself, and his villainous discovery of the flaw in her title to Pies Croft in her magnanimous oblivion of past offenses. She and Mrs. Jerome agreed over friendly cup of tea that there were a many husbands, as was very fine spoken, and all that, and yet all the while kept a will locked up from you, as tied you up as tight as anything, I assure you. Mrs. Jerome continued, dropping her voice in a confidential manner, I know no more to this day about Mr. Jerome's will nor the child, as is unborn. I've no fears about a income well, aware Mr. Jerome never leave me stret for that, but I should like to have 1,000 or 2 at my own disposal. It makes a widow a deal more looked on. Perhaps this ground of respect to widows might not be entirely without its influence on the Milby mind, and might do something towards conciliating those more aristocratic acquaintances of Janet's, who would otherwise have been inclined to take the severest view of her apostasy towards evangelicalism. Errors look so very ugly in persons of small means and feels. They are taking quite a liberty in going astray, whereas people of fortune may naturally indulge in a few delinquencies. They've got the money for it, as the girl said of her mistress, who had made herself ill with pickled salmon. However it may have been, there was not an acquaintance of Janet's in Milby that did not offer her civilities in the early days of her widowhood. Even the severe Mrs. Phipps was not an exception, for heaven knows what would become of our sociality if we never visited people we speak ill of. We should live like Egyptian hermits in crowded solitude. Perhaps the attentions most grateful to Janet were those of her old friend Mrs. Crewe, whose attachment to her favorite proved quite too strong for any resentment she might be supposed to feel on the score of Mr. Tryon. The little deaf old lady couldn't do without her accustomed visitor, whom she had seen grow up from child to woman, always so willing to chat with her and tell her all the news though she was deaf, while other people thought it tiresome to shout in her ear and irritated her by recommending ear trumpets of various construction. All this friendliness was very precious to Janet. She was conscious of the aid it gave her in the self-conquest, which was the blessing she prayed for with every fresh morning. The chief strength of her nature lay in her affection, which colored all the rest of her mind. It gave a personal sisterly tenderness to her acts of benevolence. It made her cling with tenacity to every object that had once stirred her kindly emotions. Alas, it was unsatisfied, wounded affection that had made her trouble greater than she could bear, and now there was no check to the full flow of that plenteous current in her nature. No gnawing secret anguish, no overhanging terror, no inward shame. Friendly faces beamed on her. She felt that friendly hearts were approving her and wishing her well, and that mild sunshine of goodwill fell beneficently on her new hopes and efforts, as the clear shining after rain falls on the tender leaf buds of spring and wins them from promise to fulfillment. And she needed these secondary helps, for her wrestling with her past self was not always easy. The strong emotions, from which the life of a human being receives a new bias, win their victory, as the sea wins his, though their advance may be sure they will often, after a mightier wave than usual, seem to roll back so far as to lose all the ground they had made. Janet showed the strong bent of her will by taking every outward precaution against the occurrence of a temptation. Her mother was now her constant companion, having shut up her little dwelling and come to reside in Orchard Street, and Janet gave all dangerous keys into her keeping, entreating her to lock them away in some secret place. Whenever the too well-known depression and craving threatened her, she would seek a refuge in what had always been her purest enjoyment, in visiting one of her poor neighbors, in carrying some food or comfort to a sickbed, in cheering with her smile some of the familiar dwellings up the dingy back lanes. But the great source of courage, the great help to perseverance, was the sense that she had a friend and teacher in Mr. Tryon. She could confess her difficulties to him. She knew he prayed for her. She had always before her the prospect of soon seeing him and hearing words of admonition and comfort that came to her charged with a divine power, such as she had never found in human words before. So the time passed till it was far on in May, nearly a month after her husband's death, when, as she and her mother were seated peacefully at breakfast in the dining-room, looking through the open window at the old-fashioned garden, where the grass plot was now whitened with apple blossoms, a letter was brought in for Mrs. Rayner. "Why, there's the Thurston postmark on it," she said. "It must be about your Aunt Anna. Ah, so it is. Poor thing, she's been taken worse this last day or two, and has asked them to send for me. That dropsy is carrying her off at last, I dare say. Poor thing. It will be a happy release. I must go, my dear. She's your father's last sister, though. I am sorry to leave you. However, perhaps I shall not have to stay more than a night or two." Janet looked distressed as she said, "Yes, you must go, mother. But I don't know what I shall do without you. I think I shall run in to Mrs. Pettifer and ask her to come and stay with me while you're away. I am sure she will." At 12 o'clock, Janet, having seen her mother in the coach that was to carry her to Thurston, called on her way back at Mrs. Pettifer's, but found to her great disappointment that her old friend was gone out for the day. So she wrote on a leaf of her pocketbook an urgent request that Mrs. Pettifer would come and stay with her while her mother was away, and desiring the servant girl to give it to her mistress as soon as she came home, walked on to the vicarage to sit with Mrs. Crewe, thinking to relieve in this way the feeling of desolateness and undefined fear that was taking possession of her on being left alone for the first time since that great crisis in her life. And Mrs. Crewe, too, was not at home. Janet, with a sense of discouragement, for which she rebuked herself as childish, walked sadly home again, and when she entered the vacant dining-room, she could not help bursting into tears. It is such vague, undefinable states of susceptibility, as the states of excitement or depression, half mental, half physical, that determine many a tragedy in women's lives. Janet could scarcely eat anything at her solitary dinner. She tried to fix her attention on a book in vain. She walked about the garden and felt the very sunshine melancholy. Between 4 and 5 o'clock, old Mr. Pittman called and joined her in the garden, where she had been sitting for some time under one of the great apple trees, thinking how Robert, in his best moods, used to take little Mamsie to look at the cucumbers, or to see the Alderney cow with its calf in the paddock. The tears and sobs had come again at these thoughts, and when Mr. Pittman approached her, she was feeling languid and exhausted, but the old gentleman's sight and sensibility were obtuse, and to Janet's satisfaction, He showed no consciousness that she was in grief. "I have a task to impose upon you, Mrs. Dempster," he said, with a certain toothless pomposity habitual to him. "I want you to look over those letters again in Dempster's bureau. And see, if you can find one from Poole about the mortgage on those houses at Dingley. It will be worth £20 if you can find it, and I don't know where it can be, if it isn't among those letters in the bureau. I've looked everywhere at the office for it. I am going home now, but I'll call again tomorrow, if y'all be good enough to look in the meantime." Janet said she would look directly, and turned with Mr. Pittman into the house. But the search would take her some time, so he bade her goodbye, and she went at once to a bureau which stood in a small back room, where Dempster used sometimes to write letters, and receive people who came on business out of office hours. She had looked through the contents of the bureau more than once. But today, on removing the last bundle of letters from one of the compartments, she saw what she had never seen before: a small nick in the wood made in the shape of a thumbnail, evidently intended as a means of pushing aside the movable back of the compartment. In her examination hitherto, she had not found such a letter, as Mr. Pittman had described. Perhaps there might be more letters behind this slide. She pushed it back at once, and saw no letters, but a small spirit decanter half full of pale brandy, Dempster's habitual drink. An impetuous desire shook Janet through all her members. It seemed to master her with the inevitable force of strong fumes that flood our senses before we are aware. Her hand was on the decanter pail, and excited she was lifting it out of its niche, when with a start and a shudder she dashed it to the ground, and the room was filled with the odor of the spirit. Without staying to shut up the bureau, she rushed out of the room, snatched up her bonnet and mantle which lay in the dining-room, and hurried out of the house. Where should she go? In what place would this demon that had re-entered her be scared back again? She walks rapidly along the street in the direction of the church. She is soon at the gate of the churchyard. She passes through it, and makes her way across the graves, to a spot she knows, a spot where the turf was stirred not long ago, where a tomb is to be erected soon. It is very near the church wall on the side, which now lies in deep shadow, quite shut out from the rays of the westering sun by a projecting buttress. Janet sat down on the ground. It was a somber spot. A thick hedge, surmounted by elm trees, was in front of her, a projecting buttress on each side. But she wanted to shut out even these objects. Her thick crape veil was down, but she closed her eyes behind it, and pressed her hands upon them. She wanted to summon up the vision of the past. She wanted to lash the demon out of her soul with the stinging memories of the bygone misery. She wanted to renew the old horror and the old anguish, that she might throw herself with the more desperate clinging energy at the foot of the cross, where the divine sufferer would impart divine strength. She tried to recall those first bitter moments of shame, which were like the shuddering discovery of the leper, that the dire taint is upon him. The deeper and deeper lapse the oncoming of settled despair, the awful moments by the bedside of her self-maddened husband. And then she tried to live through, with a remembrance made more vivid by that contrast, the blessed hours of hope and joy and peace that had come to her of late, since her whole soul had been bent towards the attainment of purity and holiness. But now, when the paroxysm of temptation was past, dread and despondency began to thrust themselves like cold heavy mists between her and the heaven to which she wanted to look for light and guidance. The temptation would come again. That rush of desire might overmaster her. The next time-ish would slip back again into that deep slimy pit from which she had been once rescued, and there might be no deliverance for her more. Her prayers did not help her, for fear predominated over trust. She had no confidence that the aid she sought would be given. The idea of her future fall had grasped her mind too strongly. Alone in this way, she was powerless. If she could see Mr. Tryon, if she could confess all to him, she might gather hope again. She must see him, she must go to him. Janet rose from the ground and walked away with a quick, resolved step. She had been seated there a long while, and the sun had already sunk. It was late for her to walk to Paddiford and go to Mr. Tryon's, where she had never called before, but there was no other way of seeing him that evening, and she could not hesitate about it. She walked towards a footpath through the fields, which would take her to Paddiford without obliging her to go through the town. The way was rather long, but she preferred it, because it left less probability of her meeting acquaintances, and she shrank from having to speak to anyone. The evening red had nearly faded by the time Janet knocked at Mrs. Wagstaff's door. The good woman looked surprised to see her at that hour, but Janet's morning weeds, and the painful agitation of her face, quickly brought the second thought that some urgent trouble had sent her there. "Mr. Tryon's just come in," she said. "If y'all step into the parlor, I'll go up and tell him you're here." He seemed very tired and poorly. At another time, Janet would have felt distress at the idea that she was disturbing Mr. Tryon when he required rest, but now her need was too great for that she could feel nothing but a sense of coming relief when she heard his step on the stair and saw him enter the room. He went towards her with a look of anxiety and said, "I fear something is the matter. I fear you are in trouble." Then poor Janet poured forth her sad tale of temptation and despondency, and even while she was confessing, she felt half her burden removed the act of confiding in human sympathy, the consciousness that a fellow being was listening to her, with patient pity, prepared her soul for that stronger leap by which faith grasps the idea of the divine sympathy. When Mr. Tryon spoke words of consolation and encouragement, she could now believe the message of mercy. The waterfloods that had threatened to overwhelm her rolled back again, and life once more spread its heaven-covered space before her. She had been unable to pray alone, but now his prayer bore her own soul along with it, as the broad tongue of flame carries upwards in its vigorous leap the little flickering fire that could hardly keep alight by itself. But Mr. Tryon was anxious that Janet should not linger out at this late hour. When he saw that she was calmed, he said, "I will walk home with you now. We can talk on the way." But Janet's mind was now sufficiently at liberty for her to notice the signs of feverish weariness in his appearance, and she would not hear of causing him any further fatigue. "No, no," she said earnestly, "you will pain me very much indeed. You will by going out again tonight on my account. There is no real reason why I should not go alone." And when he persisted, fearing that, for her to be seen out so late alone might excite remark, she said imploringly with a half-sob in her voice, "What would others like me do? If you went from us, why will you not think more of that, and take care of yourself?" He had often had that appeal made to him before, but tonight from Janet's lips it seemed to have a new force for him, and he gave way at first. Indeed, he only did so on condition that she would let Mrs. Wagstaff go with her. But Janet had determined to walk home alone. She preferred solitude. She wished not to have her present feelings distracted by any conversation. So she went out into the dewy starlight, and as Mr. Tryon turned away from her, he felt a stronger wish than ever that his fragile life might last out for him to see Janet's restoration thoroughly established, see her no longer fleeing, struggling, clinging up the steep sides of a precipice whence she might be any moment hurled back into the depths of despair, but walking firmly on the level ground of habit. He inwardly resolved that nothing but a peremptory duty should ever take him from Milbathat. He would not cease to watch over her until life forsook him. Janet walked on quickly till she turned into the fields, then she slackened her pace, a little enjoying the sense of solitude which a few hours before had been intolerable to her. The divine presence did not now seem far off where she had not wings to reach it. Prayer itself seemed superfluous in those moments of calm. Trust the temptation which had so lately made her shudder before the possibilities of the future was now a source of confidence, for had she not been delivered from it, had not rescue come in the extremity of danger, yes, infinite love was caring for her. She felt like a little child, whose hand is firmly grasped by its father, as its frail limbs make their way over the rough ground. If it should stumble, the father will not let it go. That walk in the dewy starlight remained forever in Janet's memory as one of those baptismal epochs when the soul dipped in the sacred waters of joy, and peace rises from them with new energies, with more unalterable longings. When she reached home, she found Mrs. Pettifer there, anxious for her return. After thanking her for coming, Janet only said, "I have been to Mr. Tryon's. I wanted to speak to him." And then, remembering how she had left the bureau and papers, she went into the back room, where apparently no one had been since she quitted it, for there lay the fragments of glass, and the room was still full of the hateful odor. How feeble and miserable the temptation seemed to her at this moment. She rang for Kitty to come and pick up the fragments and rub the floor, while she herself replaced the papers and locked up the bureau. The next morning, when seated at breakfast with Mrs. Pettifer, Janet said, "What a dreary, unhealthy-looking place. That is where Mr. Tryon lives. I am sure it must be very bad for him to live there. Do you know, all this morning, since I've been awake, I've been turning over a little plan in my mind. I think it a charming one, all the more because you are concerned in it." "Why, what can that be?" "You know that house on the Red Hill Road they call Hollymount? It is shut up now. That is Robert's house, at least it is mine now, and it stands on one of the healthiest spots about here. Now I've been settling in my own mind that if a dear good woman of my acquaintance, who knows how to make a home as comfortable and cozy as a bird's nest, were to take up her abode there, and have Mr. Tryon as a lodger, she would be doing one of the most useful deeds in all her useful life. You've such a way of wrapping up things in pretty words, you must speak plainer. In plain words, then I should like to settle you at Hollymount. You would not have to pay any more rent than where you are. And it would be 20 times pleasanter for you than living up that passage, where you see nothing but a brick wall. And then as it is not far from Paddiford, I think Mr. Tryon might be persuaded to lodge with you, instead of in that musty house among dead cabbages and smoky cottages. I know you would like to have him live with you, and you would be such a mother to him. To be sure I should like it, it would be the finest thing in the world for me. But there'll be furniture, wanted my little bit of furniture won't fill that house. Oh, I can put some in out of this house, it is too full, and we can buy the rest. They tell me I am to have more money than I shall know what to do with. I am almost afraid, said Mrs. Pettiford doubtfully, Mr. Tryon will hardly be persuaded. He's been talked to so much about leaving that place, and he always said he must stay there, must be among the people, and there was no other place for him in Paddiford. It cuts me to the heart to see him getting thinner and thinner, and I've noticed him quite short o' breath. Sometimes Mrs. Linnet will have it Mrs. Wagstaff half poisons him with bad cooking. I don't know about that, but he can't have many comforts. I expect he'll break down all of a sudden some day, and never be able to preach any more. Well, I shall try my skill with him by and by. I shall be very cunning, and say nothing to him, till all is ready. You and I and Mother, when she comes home, will set to work directly and get the house in order. And then we'll get you snugly settled in it. I shall see Mr. Pittman today, and I will tell him what I mean to do. I shall say I wish to have you for a tenant. Everybody knows I am very fond of that naughty person Mrs. Pettifer, so it will seem the most natural thing in the world. And then I shall by and by point out to Mr. Tryon that he will be doing you a service as well as himself, by taking up his abode with you. I think I can prevail upon him. For last night, when he was quite bent on coming out into the night air, I persuaded him to give it up. Well, I only hope you may, my dear. I don't desire anything better than to do something towards prolonging Mr. Tryon's life, for I've sad fears about him. Don't speak of them, I can't bear to think of them. We will only think about getting the house ready. We shall be as busy as bees. How we shall want Mother's clever fingers. I know the room upstairs that will just do for Mr. Tryon's study. There shall be no seats in it, except a very easy chair and a very easy sofa, so that he shall be obliged to rest himself when he comes home. Chapter 26. That was the last terrible crisis of temptation. Janet had to pass through the goodwill of her neighbors, the helpful sympathy of the friends who shared her religious feelings, the occupations suggested to her by Mr. Tryon, concurred with her strong spontaneous impulses towards works of love and mercy, to fill up her days with quiet social intercourse and charitable exertion. Besides, her constitution, naturally healthy and strong, was every week tending with the gathering force of habit to recover its equipoise, and set her free from those physical solicitations, which the smallest habitual vice always leaves behind it. The prisoner feels where the iron has galled him long after his fetters have been loosed. There were always neighborly visits to be paid and received, and as the months wore on, increasing familiarity with Janet's present self began to efface even from minds as rigid as Mrs. Phipp's the unpleasant impressions that had been left by recent years. Janet was recovering the popularity which her beauty and sweetness of nature had won for her when she was a girl, and popularity, as everyone knows, is the most complex and self-multiplying of echoes. Even anti-Tryonite prejudice could not resist the fact that Janet Dempster was a changed woman, changed as the dusty, bruised, and sun-withered plant is changed when the soft rains of heaven have fallen on it, and that this change was due to Mr. Tryon's influence. The last lingering sneers against the evangelical curate began to die out, and though much of the feeling that had prompted them remained behind, there was an intimidating consciousness that the expression of such feeling would not be effective. Jokes of that sort had ceased to tickle the Milby mind. Even Mr. Budd and Mr. Tomlinson, when they saw Mr. Tryon passing pale and worn along the street, had a secret sense that this man was somehow not that very natural and comprehensible thing, a humbug that, in fact, it was impossible to explain him from the stomach and pocket point of view. Twist and stretch their theory as they might, it would not fit Mr. Tryon. And so, with that remarkable resemblance as to mental processes, which may frequently be observed to exist between plain men and philosophers, they concluded that the less they said about him the better. Among all Janet's neighborly pleasures, there was nothing she liked better than to take an early tea at the White House, and to stroll with Mr. Jerome round the old-fashioned garden and orchard. There was endless matter for talk between her and the good old man, for Janet had that genuine delight in human fellowship, which gives an interest to all personal details that come warm from truthful lips, and besides they had a common interest in good-natured plans for helping their poorer neighbors. One great object of Mr. Jerome's charities was, as he often said, to keep industrious men and women off the parish id, where they're given 10 shillin', and help a man to stand on his own legs, nor pay half a crown to buy him a parish crutch. It's the ruination on him if he once goes to the parish. I've seed many a time if you help a man, why a present in a neighborly way it sweetens his blood, thinks it kind on you, but the parish shillins turn it sour. Never thinks him enough. In illustration of this opinion, Mr. Jerome had a large store of details about such persons as Jim Hardy the coal career, as lost his hoss, and Sally Butts as he dee to sell her mangle, though she was as decent a woman as need to be, to the hearing of which details Janet seriously inclined. And you would hardly desire to see a prettier picture than the kind-faced, white-haired old man telling these fragments of his simple experience as he walked with shoulders slightly bent among the moss roses and espalier apple trees, while Janet, in her widow's cap, her dark eyes bright with interest, went listening by his side, and little Lizzie, with her nankeen bonnet hanging down her back, toddled on before them. Mrs. Jerome usually declined these lingering strolls, and often observed, "I never see the like to Mr. Jerome when he's got Mrs. Dempster to talk to. It signifies nothin' to him whether we've tea at 4 or at 5 o'clock, he dee go on till 6 if you'd let him alone, slike off his head." However, Mrs. Jerome herself could not deny that Janet was a very predispoken woman. She always says she never gets sich pikelets as mine nowhere. I know that very well. Other folks buy 'em at shops, thick unwholesome things, you might as well eat a sponge. The sight of little Lizzie often stirred in Janet's mind a sense of the childlessness which had made a fatal blank in her life. She had fleeting thoughts that perhaps among her husband's distant relatives there might be some children whom she could help to bring up, some little girl whom she might adopt, and she promised herself one day or other to hunt out a second cousin of some married woman of whom he had lost sight for many years. But at present, her hands and heart were too full for her to carry out that scheme. To her great disappointment, her project of settling Mrs. Pettifer at Holly Mount had been delayed by the discovery that some repairs were necessary in order to make the house habitable, and it was not till September had set in that she had the satisfaction of seeing her old friend comfortably installed, and the rooms destined for Mr. Tryon looking pretty and cozy to her heart's content. She had taken several of his chief friends into her confidence, and they were warmly wishing success to her plan for inducing him to quit poor Mrs. Wagstaff's dingy house and dubious cookery. That he should consent to some such change was becoming more and more a matter of anxiety to his hearers, for though no more decided symptoms were yet observable in him than increasing emaciation, a dry hacking cough, and an occasional shortness of breath, it was felt that the fulfillment of Mr. Pratt's prediction could not long be deferred, and that this obstinate persistence in labor and self-disregard must soon be peremptorily cut short by a total failure of strength. Any hopes that the influence of Mr. Tryon's father and sister would prevail on him to change his mode of life, that they would perhaps come to live with him, or that his sister at least might come to see him, and that the arguments which had failed from other lips might be more persuasive from hers, were now quite dissipated. His father had lately had an attack of paralysis, and could not spare his only daughter's tendance on Mr. Tryon's return from a visit to his father. Miss Linnet was very anxious to know whether his sister had not urged him to try change of air. From his answers, she gathered that Miss Tryon wished him to give up his curacy and travel, or at least go to the South Devonshire coast. "And why will you not do so?" Miss Linnet said. "You might come back to us well and strong, and have many years of usefulness before you." "No," he answered quietly, "I think people attach more importance to such measures than is warranted. I don't see any good end that is to be served by going to die at Nice, instead of dying amongst one's friends and one's work. I cannot leave Milby, at least I will not leave it voluntarily." But though he remained immovable on this point, he had been compelled to give up his afternoon service on the Sunday, and to accept Mr. Perry's offer of aid in the evening service, as well as to curtail his weekday labors. And he had even written to Mr. Prendergast to request that he would appoint another curate to the Paddiford district, on the understanding that the new curate should receive the salary, but that Mr. Tryon should cooperate with him as long as he was able, the hopefulness which is an almost constant attendant on consumption, had not the effect of deceiving him as to the nature of his malady, or of making him look forward to ultimate recovery. He believed himself to be consumptive, and he had not yet felt any desire to escape the early death which he had for some time contemplated as probable. Even diseased hopes will take their direction from the strong habitual bias of the mind, and to Mr. Tryon death had for years seemed nothing else than the laying down of a burden, under which he sometimes felt himself fainting. He was only sanguine about his powers of work. He flattered himself that what he was unable to do one week he should be equal to the next, and he would not admit that in desisting from any part of his labor, he was renouncing it permanently. He had lately delighted Mr. Jerome by accepting his long-proffered loan of the little chestnut hoss, and he found so much benefit from substituting constant riding exercise for walking that he began to think he should soon be able to resume some of the work he had dropped. That was a happy afternoon for Janet, when after exerting herself busily for a week with her mother and Mrs. Pettifer, she saw Holly Mount looking orderly and comfortable from attic to cellar. It was an old red brick house with 2 gables in front, and 2 clipped holly trees, flanking the garden gate, a simple homely-looking place that quiet people might easily get fond of, and now it was scoured and polished and carpeted and furnished, so as to look really snug within when there was nothing more to be done. Janet delighted herself with contemplating Mr. Tryon's study, first sitting down in the easy-chair, and then lying for a moment on the sofa, that she might have a keener sense of the repose he would get from those well-stuffed articles of furniture, which she had gone to Rotherby on purpose to choose. "Now, mother," she said, when she had finished her survey, "you have done your work as well as any fairmother or godmother that ever turned a pumpkin into a coach, and horses you stay, and have tea cozily with Mrs. Pettifer, while I go to Mrs. Linnet's. I want to tell Mary and Rebecca the good news that I've got the exciseman to promise that he will take Mrs. Wagstaff's lodgings. When Mr. Tryon leaves they'll be so pleased to hear it, because they thought he would make her poverty an objection to his leaving her." "But my dear child," said Mrs. Rayner, whose face always calm was now a happy one, "have a cup of tea with us first, y'all. Perhaps Mrs. Linnet's tea time." "No, I feel too excited to take tea, yet I am like a child with a new baby house. Walking in the air will do me good." So she set out. Holly Mount was about a mile from that outskirt of Paddiford Common, where Mrs. Linnet's house stood nestled among its laburnums, lilacs, and syringas. Janet's way thither lay for a little while along the highroad, and then led her into a deep-rutted lane, which wound through a flat tract of meadow and pasture, while in front lay smoky Paddiford, and away to the left the mother town of Milby. There was no line of silvery willows marking the course of a stream, no group of Scotch firs, with their trunks reddening in the level sunbeams, nothing to break the flowerless monotony of grass and hedgerow, but an occasional oak or elm, and a few cows sprinkled here and there. A very commonplace scene indeed. But what scene was ever commonplace in the descending sunlight, when color has awakened from its noonday sleep, and the long shadows awe us like a disclosed presence? Above all, what scene is commonplace to the eye, that is filled with serene gladness, and brightens all things with its own joy? And Janet just now was very happy as she walked along the rough lane, with a buoyant step. A half-smile of innocent, kindly triumph played about her mouth. She was delighting beforehand in the anticipated success of her persuasive power, and for the time her painful anxiety about Mr. Tryon's health was thrown into abeyance. But she had not gone far along the lane before she heard the sound of a horse advancing at a walking pace behind her without looking back. She turned aside to make way for it between the ruts, and did not notice that for a moment it had stopped, and had then come on with a slightly quickened pace. In less than a minute, she heard a well-known voice say Mrs. Dempster, and turning saw Mr. Tryon close to her holding his horse by the bridle. It seemed very natural to her that he should be there. Her mind was so full of his presence at that moment that the actual sight of him was only like a more vivid thought, and she behaved as we are apt to do when feeling obliges us to be genuine, with a total forgetfulness of polite forms. She only looked at him with a slight deepening of the smile that was already on her face. He said gently, "Take my arm," and they walked on a little way in silence. It was he who broke it. "You are going to Paddiford, I suppose?" The question recalled Janet to the consciousness that this was an unexpected opportunity for beginning her work of persuasion, and that she was stupidly neglecting it. "Yes," she said, "I was going to Mrs. Linnet's. I knew Miss Linnet would like to hear that our friend Mrs. Pettifer is quite settled now in her new house. She is as fond of Mrs. Pettifer as I am. Almost, I won't admit that anyone loves her quite as well for no one else, has such good reason as I have. But now the dear woman wants a lodger, for you know she can't afford to live in so large a house by herself. But I knew when I persuaded her to go there that she would be sure to get Wunches, such a comfortable creature to live with, and I didn't like her to spend all the rest of her days up that dull passage being at everyone's beck, and call who wanted to make use of her. Yes, said Mr. Tryon, I quite understand your feeling. I don't wonder at your strong regard for her. Well, but now I want her other friends to second me. There she is with 3 rooms to let ready furnished, everything in order. And I know someone who thinks as well of her as I do, and who would be doing good all round to every one that knows him, as well as to Mrs. Pettifer if he would go to live. With her he would leave some uncomfortable lodgings, which another person is already coveting, and would take immediately, and he would go to breathe pure air at Holly Mount, and gladden Mrs. Pettifer's heart by letting her wait on him, and comfort all his friends who are quite miserable about him. Mr. Tryon saw it all in a moment, saw that it had all been done for his sake. He could not be sorry, he could not say no, he could not resist the sense that life had a new sweetness for him, and that he should like it to be prolonged a little, for the sake of feeling a stronger security about Janet. When she had finished speaking, she looked at him with a doubtful, inquiring glance. He was not looking at her, his eyes were cast downwards, but the expression of his face encouraged her, and she said in a half-playful tone of entreaty, You will go and live with her, I know you will come back with me now and see the house. He looked at her then, and smiled. There is an unspeakable blending of sadness and sweetness in the smile of a face sharpened and paled by slow consumption. That smile of Mr. Tryon's pierced poor Janet's heart. She felt in it at once the assurance of grateful affection and the prophecy of coming death. Her tears rose. They turned round without speaking and went back again along the lane. Chapter 27. In less than a week Mr. Tryon was settled at Holly Mount, and there was not one of his many attached hearers who did not sincerely rejoice at the event. The autumn that year was bright and warm, and at the beginning of October Mr. Walsh, the new curate, came. The mild, whether the relaxation from excessive work, and perhaps another benignant influence, had for a few weeks a visibly favorable effect on Mr. Tryon. At least, he began to feel new hopes, which sometimes took the guise of new strength. He thought of the cases in which consumption patients remain nearly stationary for years without suffering, so as to make their life burdensome to themselves or to others, and he began to struggle with a longing that it might be so with him. He struggled with it because he felt it to be an indication that earthly affection was beginning to have too strong a hold on him, and he prayed earnestly for more perfect submission, and for a more absorbing delight in the divine presence as the chief good. He was conscious that he did not wish for prolonged life solely that he might reclaim the wanderers and sustain the feeble. He was conscious of a new yearning for those pure human joys which he had voluntarily and determinedly banished from his life, for a draught of that deep affection from which he had been cut off by a dark chasm of remorse. For now that affection was within his reach. He saw it there, like a pomshadowed well in the desert. He could not desire to die in sight of it. And so the autumn rolled gently by in its calm decay, until November. Mr. Tryon continued to preach occasionally, to ride about visiting his flock, and to look in at his schools, but his growing satisfaction in Mr. Walsh, as his successor, saved him from too eager exertion, and from worrying anxieties. Janet was with him a great deal now, for she saw that he liked her to read to him in the lengthening evenings, and it became the rule for her and her mother to have tea at Holly Mount, where with Mrs. Pettifer, and sometimes another friend or two, they brought Mr. Tryon the unaccustomed enjoyment of companionship by his own fireside. Janet did not share his new hopes, for she was not only in the habit of hearing Mr. Pratt's opinion that Mr. Tryon could hardly stand out through the winter, but she also knew that it was shared by Dr. Madeley of Rotherby, whom at her request he had consented to call in. It was not necessary or desirable to tell Mr. Tryon what was revealed by the stethoscope, but Janet knew the worst. She felt no rebellion under this prospect of bereavement, but rather a quiet submissive sorrow, gratitude that his influence and guidance had been given her, even if only for a little while, gratitude that she was permitted to be with him, to take a deeper and deeper impress from daily communion with him, to be something to him in these last months of his life was so strong in her that it almost silenced regret. Janet had lived through the great tragedy of woman's life. Her keenest personal emotions had been poured forth in her early love. Her wounded affection, with its years of anguish or agony, of unavailing pity over that deathbed. 7 months ago, the thought of Mr. Tryon was associated for her with repose from that conflict of emotion, with trust in the unchangeable, with the influx of a power to subdue self. To have been assured of his sympathy, his teaching, his help all through her life, would have been to her like a heaven already begun, a deliverance from fear and danger. But the time was not yet come for her to be conscious that the hold he had on her heart was any other than that of the heaven-sent friend, who had come to her like the angel in the prison, and loosed her bonds, and led her by the hand, till she could look back on the dreadful doors that had once closed her in. Before November was over, Mr. Tryon had ceased to go out. A new crisis had come on. The cough had changed its character, and the worst symptoms developed themselves so rapidly that Mr. Pratt began to think the end would arrive sooner than he had expected. Janet became a constant attendant on him now, and no one could feel that she was performing anything but a sacred office. She made Holly mount her home, and with her mother and Mrs. Pettifer to help her, she filled the painful days and nights with every soothing influence that care and tenderness could devise. There were many visitors to the sick room led thither by venerating affection, and there could hardly be one who did not retain in after years a vivid remembrance of the scene, thereof the pale wasted form in the easy-chair, for he sat up to the last of the grey eyes, so full even yet of inquiring kindness, as the thin, almost transparent hand was held out to give the pressure of welcome, and of the sweet woman too, whose dark watchful eyes detected every want, and who supplied the want with a ready hand. There were others who would have had the heart and the skill to fill this place by Mr. Tryon's side, and who would have accepted it as an honor, but they could not help feeling that God had given it to Janet by a train of events which were too impressive not to shame all jealousies into silence. That sad history, which most of us know too well, lasted more than 3 months. He was too feeble and suffering for the last few weeks to see any visitors, but he still sat up through the day. The strange hallucinations of the disease, which had seemed to take a more decided hold on him just at the fatal crisis, and had made him think he was perhaps getting better at the very time when death had begun to hurry on with more rapid movement, had now given way, and left him calmly conscious of the reality. One afternoon near the end of February, Janet was moving gently about the room in the firelit dusk, arranging some things that would be wanted in the night. There was no one else in the room, and his eyes followed her as she moved with the firm grace natural to her, while the bright fire every now and then lit up her face and gave an unusual glow to its dark beauty. Even to follow her in this way with his eyes was an exertion that gave a painful tension to his face, while she looked like an image of life and strength. Janet, he said presently in his faint voice, always called her Janet now. In a moment she was close to him, bending over him. He opened his hand as he looked up at her, and she placed hers within it. Janet, he said again, you will have a long while to live after I am gone. A sudden pang of fear shot through her. She thought he felt himself dying, and she sank on her knees at his feet, holding his hand, while she looked up at him almost breathless. But you will not feel the need of me, as you have done. You have a sure trust in God. I shall not look for you in vain at the last. No, no, I shall be there. God will not forsake me. She could hardly utter the words, though she was not weeping. She was waiting with trembling eagerness for anything else he might have to say. Let us kiss each other before we part. She lifted up her face to his, and the full life-breathing lips met the wasted dying ones in a sacred kiss of promise. Chapter 28. It soon cometh, blessed day of deliverance, the sad day of bereavement, and in the 2nd week of March, they carried him to the grave. He was buried, as he had desired. There was no hearse, no mourning coach. His coffin was borne by 12 of his humbler hearers, who relieved each other by turns, but he was followed by a long procession of mourning friends, women as well as men. Slowly, amid deep silence, the dark stream passed along Orchard Street, where 18 months before the evangelical curate had been saluted with hooting and hisses. Mr. Jerome and Mr. Landor were the eldest pallbearers, and behind the coffin, led by Mr. Tryon's cousin, walked Janet in quiet submissive sorrow. She could not feel that he was quite gone from her. The unseen world lay so very near her. It held all that had ever stirred the depths of anguish and joy within her. It was a cloudy morning, and had been raining when they left Holly Mount, but as they walked the sun broke out and the clouds were rolling off in large masses when they entered the churchyard, and Mr. Walsh's voice was heard saying, I am the resurrection and the life. The faces were not hard at this funeral. The burial service was not a hollow form. Every heart there was filled with the memory of a man who, through a self-sacrificing life, and in a painful death had been sustained by the faith which fills that form with breath and substance. When Janet left the grave, she did not return to Holly Mount. She went to her home in Orchard Street, where her mother was waiting to receive her. She said quite calmly, "Let us walk round the garden, mother." And they walked round in silence with their hands clasped together. Looking at the golden crocuses bright in the spring sunshine, Janet felt a deep stillness within. She thirsted for no pleasure, she craved no worldly good. She saw the years to come stretch before her like an autumn afternoon, filled with resigned memory. Life to her could never more have any eagerness. It was a solemn service of gratitude and patient effort. She walked in the presence of unseen witnesses of the divine love that had rescued her of the human love that waited for its eternal repose, until it had seen her endure to the end. Janet is living still. Her black hair is gray, and her step is no longer buoyant, but the sweetness of her smile remains. The love is not gone from her eyes, and strangers sometimes ask, "Who is that noble-looking elderly woman that walks about holding a little boy?" By the hand, the little boy is the son of Janet's adopted daughter, and Janet in her old age has children about her knees and loving young arms round her neck. There is a simple gravestone in Milby churchyard, telling that in this spot lie the remains of Edgar Tryon, for 2 years officiating curate at the Paddiford Chaploff Ease in this parish. It is a meager memorial, and tells you simply that the man who lies there took upon him faithfully or unfaithfully the office of guide and instructor to his fellow men. But there is another memorial of Edgar Tryon, which bears a fuller record. It is Janet Dempster, rescued from self-despair, strengthened with divine hopes, and now looking back on years of purity and helpful labor. The man who has left such a memorial behind him must have been one whose heart beat with true compassion and whose lips were moved by fervent faith. The end.